Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Missing Legendary Lords Chaos Edition. Now, a quick caveat before we start things off today. In this edition, I have mainly focused on the Legendary Lords in the 8th edition of the Chaos Army book. Now, there are Legendary Lords who are mentioned before the 8th edition, there are Legendary Lords mentioned in the End Times, there are Forge World Legendary Lords. Chaos has a lot of potential Legendary Lords, but I just focused on the ones featured in the 8th edition Army book, because I think those are the ones most likely to appear in Total War Warhammer in the near to medium future, and the ones we're most likely to see appearing in at least this iteration of the game before we get the first expansion, and even in the first expansion as well. So I focused on those ones. I know there are others, guys. If any race deserves probably a part 2, it's probably Chaos, and I may well do a part 2 in the future. But for now, we're just focusing on those Legendary Lords that featured in the Chaos Army Book 8th edition. And we're kicking things off with a bang here with Wulfrik the Wanderer. Now, Wulfrik grew up a member of the Scyla tribe. He always had a skill for martial ability, and quickly rose through the ranks of the Scyla warriors to become a champion of the Scyla people. Around the year of the Imperial calendar 2519, so kind of bang on the Total War Warhammer starting timeline, the Scylas and the Eilings, their northern cousins over here, started to be in conflict. They had a bit of a dispute, and tensions were rising, and an armed conflict seemed inevitable. The leader of the Eilings, or Eslings, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, at the time was a chap called Throgg. Now, Throgg was a fearsome Chaos Warrior in his own right, and he'd had a dispute with Vilitch, who was the leader of the Scylas at the time, and had indeed been a chosen champion of Chaos, particularly of the god Zenich, or Zenich, however you want to say it. And he was a bit of a slight guy. He wasn't really the typical thing you might picture a chief being, but he was quite bright, and he'd managed to amass a considerable amount of wealth in his time as chief of the Scylas. Now, the Eilings had a huge advantage in terms of the quality of their troops and the number of their troops, but the Scylas started to go out and try to hire mercenaries to make up the numbers. They hired sort of ogres, they hired other Norscan tribes, they just got a whole bunch of mercenaries together. But because Vilitch really wasn't a fighter of any kind, he obviously had been blessed by Zenich, but had never gotten any gifts of strength or anything like that. So he goes to Wulfrik and he says, "Wulfrik, mate, can you please lead our armies into battle?" And Wulfrik's not particularly keen on this idea, and although Vilitch is technically Wulfrik's chief, Wulfrik's kind of an independent party at this point. He kind of does his own thing. There's not a lot you can do to really make him comply to you if he doesn't want to. So Vilitch tries to sweeten the deal. He's like, "Okay, Wulfrik, if you lead my armies and you win this battle, you can marry my daughter, the Princess Hjordis, who was said to be very beautiful at the time, which would give you rights to become chief after I die." So Wulfrik, who was quite an ambitious guy, sort of gave the once-over over Hjordis, and was like, "Oh wow, what a beautiful lady. I would love to tap that ass, as it were." And Hjordis, for her own part, lusted after Wulfrik equally. She was like, "Ooh, what a burly, strapping man. What a beard on him." So they had a crush on each other, let's say. So he was like, "Okay, she's beautiful, and then I can become chief of the Scylas. Alright, I'll lead your forces into battle." Despite the fact, Vilitch, I don't really like you. For me, in my eye, I think you're a pale imitation of what a chief should be. Chief should be like me, be hugely warrior-like, muscle-bound, and be able to lead their own armies into war, not weaklings like you. So there's always been this kind of dislike between Wulfrik and Vilitch. So now the armies are set up. They clash at a battle that would become known as the Battle of 1,000 Skulls. There are axes flying everywhere. The ogre mercenaries are wreaking havoc. Wulfrik is carving his way through the enemy hordes, and eventually he comes across Throgg, the chieftain of the Eiling tribe. They engage in battle. They're dodging and weaving and twirling and hacking and slashing at each other, and eventually Wulfrik gets the upper hand and decapitates Throgg. Now, upon seeing their chieftain slain, they're beset by grief and quickly shatter, meaning the Scylas have won the day. Now, they celebrate, as any respectable Norscan clan would, with a big piss-up and a feast. So they return back, Wulfrik grabbing the head of his defeated foe, presumably boiling it up or doing whatever you have to do to get a skull within a day, and gets the skull out of the boiling pot and starts to make Torgold's skull his drinking cup for the evening. And as the evening goes on, things are getting a bit more boisterous. Wulfrik started to get in his cups, has got 1 or 2 pints in him, starting to feel a bit merry, and then starts to sort of boast around. I will drink any man in this hall under the table, just you watch me. And he kicks off a round of drinking games, which results in him single-handedly drinking down 8 barrels of mead. He managed to actually consume so many barrels of beer, he'd actually impressed the ogre mercenaries, which are quite hard to impress as far as drinking capacity goes. But they were like, oh, good job, look at that little human drinking all those beers. He must be blessed. While he's in the middle of this drinking competition, drinking out of his defeated enemy's skull, they're like, hey boys, I love you lads, we had a great little hack up, didn't we? What a wonderful day. He eventually starts to launch into a series of boasts, and it said by the time the evening was winding down, he'd boasted of slaying every person in the whole of Norska and every monster. But it was one line in particular that's said to have grabbed the attention of the gods. And that's Wulfrik saying he was equal or the better of any warrior in this entire world or in the next world. And this kind of irked the Chaos Gods. They're like, oh mate, that's a pretty braggadocious thing to say. So we might have to teach you a lesson. But at this point, he does win the competition, but he is extremely, extremely drunk. So Wulfrik potters off to his hut or wherever he's staying and collapses drunk and passes out. Now, during his sleep/unconsciousness, Wulfrik is given a vision. And in this vision, a demon appears to him, and the demon says, I'm going to show you the world, Wulfrik. In all its shining, shimmering splendor, I'm going to open your eyes and take you wonder by wonder. And him and Wulfrik suddenly are magically transported across the world. He's taken to the gleaming cities of the elves, he's taken to the dwarven Carax, he's taken to Kemri, he's taken to Ulfwan. He really gets a flying tour of the world, and Wulfrik Cohen gets the impression it's a fantastic point of view and shown him many dazzling places he never knew of. It's almost an indescribable feeling. And they spent the rest of the evening wandering through the endless diamond sky, and eventually the demon starts to explain to him what's going on. And the demon says, look Wulfrik, that statement you made earlier about being the best warrior around, kind of bullshit, but you know what, you've intrigued us. So we're going to give you a challenge. You are going to go around the world challenging the best fighters out there to prove that you're right. And if you don't manage to defeat them and you die, your eternal soul won't ever be able to come up to join Khorne in the halls of what's essentially the chaos equivalent of Valhalla. So the halls of the dead where you can drink and feast all day long with the warriors of old. And instead, you are going to be tortured for eternity by demons in kind of the equivalent of the pits of hell. And I found this quite an interesting concept, the fact that chaos has kind of an equivalent for heaven for their worshippers, but that side, Wulfrik suddenly wakes up and he notices that his mouth feels funny. He's like, what is going on? And eventually he finds someone and he's like, what's wrong with my mouth? And he sticks out his tongue, and his tongue's been all twisted and said to have knotted into the shape of that of a bird. Now, what exactly a bird tongue looks like, I'm not 100% sure myself, but you guys I'm sure can Google that one. And not only does his tongue now look like that of a bird, but he seems to be speaking in 1,000 different languages he never knew, and he seems to have this voice in his mind, or this pull in his mind that's kind of speaking to him and telling him to go to these places, and he's really just not sure what's going on. So he runs to the shaman, who's a Kurgan shaman, I think, who's one of the mercenaries, I imagine, who was brought into the Sal territories to fight the battle. And he's like, what is going on to me? Tell me what's wrong. And the shaman goes, oh, we've heard of this. This is the gift of the gods. It's called the gift of tongues. This is why you can speak. And he was like, stop it. Like, make me go back. There's voices in my head. It's driving me nuts. Cut these out. And the shaman's like, I don't know how. And Wulfrik, not being one to suffer fools gladly, decided to start torturing this poor shaman. He said to have burnt off his toes and given him a slow and horrific death, because the shaman couldn't rid Wulfrik of this curse. So without finding any help from the shaman, Wulfrik essentially has to start listening to the voice in his head, because they cause him distress, and it's just constant and incessant, and unless he starts working towards that goal, they just won't leave him alone. And the voices in his head are telling him to go and fight a Tomb Lord down in Khemri. And he's like, okay, how on earth am I going to get to Khemri? It's miles away. It's literally on the other side of the world. How do I get down there? And then he's sort of pondering this, and he chats to a few of his mates about it. It's like, how? Okay, I have to launch probably the longest, like, travel ship, one of the longest journeys the Norskins have ever gone on, I guess, on this long ship. It will take us years to get down to Khemri. And sort of overhearing this, one of Wulfrik's longtime friends sort of nudges up to you like, Wulfrik, I've heard of something, but I'm not sure if it's 100% true. And his friend was called Sigvatir. Sigvatir tells him of a story of a ship that apparently is a magical ship that can transport you anywhere you want in an instant. And Wulfrik's like, where? Where is this place? He's like, okay, if we want to go on this story that, bear in mind, I can't verify this is a true story, Wulfrik, but if you want to pursue this course, we have to go fight a witch in the Scaling territory, which is west of us. And she has a fortress there guarded by demons, and that's where she's keeping this mythical ship. So Wulfrik's like, okay, I have no other choice. These voices are going to drive me mad if I don't work towards this goal. So let's go. And essentially it took Wulfrik all of the plunder and loot Wulfrik earned and all of the rewards he earned from fighting the Aelings, he had to spend to raise an army to go and fight this witch in the tower. Now bear in mind, he hasn't married the princess after the battle because all this stuff has happened to him. He's been slightly distracted, so it's not forefront of his mind. He's trying to get all these voices in his head to stop. This is why he's committed to this course and hasn't stuck around and become chief of the Sarls. So he gathers an army with his mate and they go to the Scaling territories and they launch a raid against this fortress to try and get their ship. Now they're greeted by a number of different kinds of demons and foul creatures from the warp, but true enough to the Norscan manliness and muscle, they managed to defeat them. Wulfrik himself managed to fight all the way up to the top of the tower, encountered the witch, battled her with her magics, and managed to cut every limb from her body. Now, whether she made a threat of biting his legs off or not, we don't know, but he didn't leave it there, and instead of decapitating her or giving her a quick death, he decided to drop her in a pot of boiling water and boil her alive. It said that day Wulfrik lost 200 of his warriors, but he did manage to get the ship. He left all the plunder to his warriors because at this point Wulfrik's not really concerned with money anymore. He's just trying to get this stuff going on in his head sorted out. So they get the longship, and the longship they name Seafang. And indeed, Seafang did everything the stories told it could. It had the ability to transport you as the master of the ship wherever you wanted to go. And having killed the witch, ownership had transferred itself over to Wulfrik. Now the ship's magic wasn't free. In fact, the ship, every time you used it, required an offering of blood, and it had a particular appetite for Wulfrik's blood. Not enough to kill him, but you know, as kind of ceremonial gesture. And Wulfrik made sure that any sort of crewman he ever brought aboard the Seafang gave some blood to the ship itself. Now, the place you'd put the blood is in the dragon mouth, which was at the forefront of the ship. Wulfrik finally gets his magic ship and it's like, okay, let's see how this goes. So the way the ship works is it transports anyone on board or anyone attached to it or any like ships it can drag behind. So you can take a war host with you. You don't all have to fit onto the one ship. You can tie it with ropes and chains to other boats, and all those boats will be transported. And it said they go into a place of sort of demons and chaos magic winds. It's kind of like the warp, I guess, from 40k, except you're not automatically massacred whenever you go into it. So they all get transported to this other realm, and then through that realm they travel, which takes them to wherever they want to go in the real world. So he's like, okay, you guys have been shouting this bloody Tomb Lord Khemri, Tomb Lord Khemri, Tomb Lord Khemri in my head, so let's go. So they go off to Khemri, they get there, he launches a campaign against this bloody Tomb Lord that's been aggravating him and been in his mind for months and months and months, and he slaughters the Tomb Lord and offers his entrails to Nurgle, who apparently had been the Dark God demanding them. But it doesn't stop there. After Khemri, he gets another vision, and this is when Wulfrik starts to build up his legend and his mythos. He travels and slays a giant. In fact, it said he scalped a giant, and he's actually made his cloak out of the scalp of a giant that he killed himself, single-handed. He's fought wights, he's fought jarls, he's fought dragons. He's really just gone around killing legendary monsters and heroes all around, always where the voices keep telling him where to go. Now, with this new gift from the Chaos Gods, as Wulfrik is going around finding and facing all these champions and monsters, the gift they'd given him of being able to speak in 1,000 tongues, it also allowed him to, and kind of encouraged him and kind of made him forcefully insult any of the challengers he would face on a battlefield, and know their culture to a certain degree, kind of instinctively, that he knew exactly what to say, such as mocking dwarves for their silly beards or being beardless, or all sorts of things, from like making jokes about your mother. He had this ability to really get at the heart to what would really piss somebody off and yell it out at them across the battlefield. That's really the reason the gods gave him this gift of tongues. It wasn't just to go around communicating with everyone, but it was to go around the world yelling insults that offended people to such a degree that they couldn't help but want to kill Wulfrik. That was the gift stroke curse they gave him. The Sea Fang has made it impossible to escape from him, thus earning him name Wulfrik the Inescapable. So whenever Gods of Chaos point him towards a target, he goes, and he starts to do this over a series of years. He's just hunting down champion or monster or champion and monster, and it seems that this curse has doomed him to never-ending battle, an eternity of fighting, and that's about it. That's all he can have look forward to for the rest of his life. He will probably die in battle and be cursed to be tortured. And Wulfrik just isn't really happy with the outcome of this. It's like, yeah, of course he enjoys chopping the head off a guy as much as the next man, but he can't do this forever. And he has his own ambitions. He wants to return to the Scyla people, to become the chief, to marry that princess he likes. He has his own things that he wants to get on with in his life. And so, not secretly, but whenever he can, whenever he comes across a shaman of particular knowledge or anything, he's still always inquiring about how to get rid of this bloody curse that's been placed on him, or at least he views it as a curse that's been placed on him by the Chaos Gods. Eventually, he runs across a shaman named Zarnath. Now, Zarnath says he actually has a solution to Wulfrik's problem. Zarnath is said to have come from one of the other Norscan areas, or Norscan sort of tribal lands, and he bumped into Wulfrik on his travels. Now, what Zarnath said is that you have to go to the territories of the Chaos Dwarves to retrieve an ancient artifact of, now, I didn't come up with this name, but this is what I think it is. It's an artifact of the Hung Sorcerer Kings. Now, that's not Hun, H-U-N, that's Hung, H-U-N-G, Sorcerer Kings, called the Smile of Sardis. Now, names aside, the Smile of Sardis, he's like, okay, so if I get this, you can do magic and you can get rid of the curse. And Zarnath's like, yeah, of course I can, mate. You just go get that, and I'll go with you, and we'll go get it, and we'll sort this situation out. So Wulfrik gets a little posse together, his best mate joining him as always. Sigvtar comes with him. They raise some troops. They're like, all right, boys, here we go again. Let's go slaughter some Chaos Dwarves. Now, you might think the Chaos Gods might be a little bit miffed at them slaughtering Chaos Dwarves, but not really, because the Chaos Dwarves worship this Hashut character, which is the Bull God, which isn't really one of the official Chaos Gods, so they don't mind too much. They're okay with it. So Wulfrik and his guys launch a campaign against the Chaos Dwarves, and they're looking for a fortress of Dronagul, otherwise known as the Fortress of Iron. And it's led by a dwarven lord known as Korak, and he's the one who has this Smile of Sardis artifact. So they charge into this fortress. God knows how, with a bunch of marauders, he's able to take a Chaos Dwarf stronghold, but he is, just through sheer strength of arms and will. During the battle, he ends up fighting a four-legged bull centaur of the Chaos Dwarves and manages to slay it. He goes on to kill the dwarven lord Korak and wins the day. He eventually finds the Smile of Sardis and sort of rips it out of Korak's dead hands. But once everything's settled down and the battle's over, Wulfrik realizes his mate, Sigvtar, is dying, and he goes to him. He's like, oh no, buddy, I'm so sorry. I can't believe this happened to you. And he's like, Wulfrik, as long as it was worth it, buddy, as long as you cure yourself of the curse, I enjoyed a life of hacking and slashing, it's all cool. So he lost his best mate, and he's a little bit upset about this, but Wulfrik's a hardy chap, and kind of buckles up, chin up, and continues on the quest. And he says, okay, Zarnath, what now? And Zarnath's like, okay, to get this magic to work, we need to go to Ulthuan, the home of the High Elves, because that's where the magic is concentrated enough that I can do my jiggery pokery and cure you of your curse. So Wulfrik's like, okay, god damn it, we have to go to another bloody place full of people who hate us. Okay, we're gonna need to stack up on troops. This took a lot out of my army. We have to go back to my hometown, my home area of Norska, get some more fighters, and then we can go to Ulthuan. So he returns home, and some of the kings of the area aren't particularly happy to see him. Now, if you remember from earlier in the video, we had Viglandir, who was the leader of the Sals. Now, after Wulfrik had killed the Torgold, the leader of the Aelings, Viglandir managed to get his son, Sveinborn, to become chief of the Aelings. Now, Viglandir at this point is trying to plot an alliance between the Sal and the Aeling to make them become one very powerful Norsk tribe together. And the return of Wulfrik, who seemingly went off on a suicide mission against the Chaos Dwarves, really puts a sort of spanner in the works, because the Aelings are still pissed at him for killing their old chief. Even though Svineborn, their now current chief and son of Viglandia, wants there to be an alliance, if the people don't agree to it, he can't really make it happen. And the people both hate and sort of venerate Wulfrik. They praise his skill as a warrior, but are still pissed at him for killing their old chief. So his return to the Sarls kind of just throws a huge spanner in the works and gets everyone riled up back at home. Now, Svineborn himself isn't a particularly skilled warrior, so he can't really challenge Wulfrik to try and regain the honor of the tribe he now rules. So what he does is he kind of plots this little scheme to have Wulfrik fight somebody else. And he challenges Wulfrik, and Wulfrik, never being one to turn down a challenge, was like, okay, Svineborn, you bloody git, let's do this. I'm happy for a fight anytime. And they go to a place called the Wolf Forest. Now, the Wolf Forest is essentially a kind of raised platform in a pit of spikes that is a kind of battling arena that had been built in honor of Wulfrik, so that he could take on any challengers there and, you know, just be the kick-ass duelist that he is. So Wulfrik turns up, he's like, oh, I'm going to fight bloody Svineborn. He's a bit of a pushover, this won't be much of a hassle. But Svineborn's actually nominated a champion, and this kind of hulking monstrosity walks onto the platform to fight Wulfrik, and it's huge and clad in black plate, and Wulfrik's like, who the hell is this? He's like the size of a troll. Is this even a person? And eventually, like, it kind of speaks or makes noise, and he eventually starts to put it together. There's parts of this chap he recognizes, and he recognizes it's a guy he used to know or hear about called Freymir. Now, Freymir was a powerful Chaos Lord at one point, but it seems that he'd become a Forsaken. So the Chaos Gods kind of set him aside or given him too many gifts, and he's become a bit messed up. And he has this kind of claw hand thing going on, and Wulfrik's not really sure what to make. He's like, okay, this is going to be a bit of a challenge, this massive bloody Forsaken champion. And they begin to duel, and Wulfrik's spinning and weaving, and eventually manages to slice off Freymir's arm. Now, in place of Freymir's arm, like, Wulfrik's like, okay, victory won, arm's gone, gonna bleed to death. Done, let's go get some lunch. But instead of like collapsing or dying or anything, a huge spike erupts out of the socket where Freymir's arm used to be, and he keeps coming after Wulfrik. And Wulfrik's like, oh god damn it, what the hell is this guy? And he ducks and weaves and manages to slice Faramir across the stomach, and thinking, okay, disemboweled him, that should do it. But instead of sort of a fountain of blood and the guy collapsing on himself, just these tentacles kind of burst forth from his stomach. So now you've got this clawed, spike-armed, bloody tentacle monster coming at him, and Wulfrik is running out of options. He's like, okay, I seemingly can't kill this bloody thing. So he kind of maneuvers, and realizing that Faramir is now more of a beast than he was a man, than he is the thinking sort of champion he was of old, he kind of leads him towards the edge of the thing and manages to kind of trick him and trip him and push him off the platform. At which point, the monstrosity skewers itself on one of these spikes below. Jumping down to kind of finally deal with him, Wulfrik delves his sword, splitting the helmet of this monstrosity and its skull at the same time, emerging victorious. And so Svineborn's little ploy has failed, and he hasn't managed to kill Wulfrik. Wulfrik at this point seems very merciful, almost out of characterly merciful, and it's like, okay, I won the champion, that was an interesting fight, I'm off to do something else. I need to go get some guys, we're going to go fight in Ulthuan. And he kind of uses it as a bit of a recruiting thing. Look how great I am, guys, let's go get some loot and plunder, come with me, lads. So he raises his army, and amongst some of these recruits is a chap called Broendulf. Now, Broendulf is kind of a bit of a sneaky git, and he's taken aside by Svineborn, the clan leader of the Aelings, just to remind you guys. And the clan leader kind of says, look, Broendulf, let's have a chat here. Once his back's turned, can you kind of just deal with Warhammer? Just like stab him quickly, like put an axe in his head. Just do something, get him off the playing board so we can make this alliance. And so once my father passes on, I will be the leader of both clans, Sarl and Aeling, and we'll combine and we'll become the most significant force in Norsca. And I'll give you some gold for it too. So Broendulf is like, okay, alright, I'll do it. I'll kill him, I'll stab him in the back, and we'll do it. So Broendulf joins the forces of Wulfrik and his army, who's going to Ulthuan, and they go, and they sort of go over there, and it's like, alright, cool, off we go. Of course, with Sifang, it just takes them a moment. They arrive on the shores of Ulthuan, and they all sort of disembark in his army, and they eventually come across, like, sort of sneaking around, they see this group of women praying in this temple. And Zarnaf is like, oh my god, whoa, watch out, guys, get down, everyone hide. Okay guys, this is a little plethora of legendary witches. Now we have to quickly get set upon them and kill them all before they can get any of their magic off and affect our minds and kill us. So we have to do this quickly and quietly and just massacre all of them. Don't leave a single one alive. So Wulfrik's like, okay, cool, I got the idea. No, let's kill the witches. So they sneak up on them and just slaughter all the women in this temple. Just run them through, just go completely nuts with bloodlust, plunder the temple, get all the gold, and they're like, woohoo! Great job, guys, killed all those witches. And at this point, there's this kind of this cackling in the background. And it's Zarnath, and Wulfrik's like, okay, Zarnath, what's up? Zarnath, what's up with the cackling? And Zarnath's like, Wulfrik, you fool. I was never trying to cure you of your curse. You've just made me a more powerful wizard. You got me the smiles of Sardin, and now, and to be fair, I wasn't even expecting that. I was just trying to lead you to your death because you were a potential future problem for the civilized world. So I was just trying to get you dead, Wulfrik. Oh, and by the way, those witches that you just slaughtered were just the wives of elven nobles who were coming to this temple of fertility just to pray to have babies, or if they were pregnant, that their babies would be healthy. So you are about to face a wrath unlike any you faced before from the High Elves. So enjoy that. Zarnath out, and he just kind of disappears. And Wulfrik's like, what the hell was that? Zarnath lied and betrayed me. I'm going to unleash hell on that guy. But before he knows it, he is set upon by a huge army of elves, of silver helms just come charging down, and it's just a gruesome bloodbath. Wulfrik and his men are fighting back to back. They're completely surrounded, and at the end of the day, as the dust settles on the battlefield, there's only 2 Norskins surviving, and they happen to be Wulfrik and Broendulf. And Broendulf just, like, Wulfrik, you saved my life so many times during that battle. Despite the fact that everyone else is dead, I'm only really alive because of you. I have something to tell you. Svineborn and your own chief, Viglandia, have been plotting against you this whole time. They were hoping you would die. The dwarves, like, they asked me to kill you. It's suspected they worked with Zarnath to get you killed as well. Essentially, they've been plotting to kill you ever since your initial battle against the Aelings, because you were a sort of a roadblock on their way to joining those 2 tribes together and becoming the powerhouse of the North. You've essentially been a thorn in their side, and they've been trying to kill you this entire time. In fact, Viglandia never intended for you to marry his daughter. Now, I may be a little bit wrong on the lore here, guys, but from what I can gather, he's instead plotted to have Svineborn, his son, marry his daughter, Hjodris, and that's the coupling he wants to have happen, who will rule over this new kingdom he's trying to set up. And they've just been trying to kill you for this entire time over that. Wulfrik is distraught. His ships have kind of been burnt and put to the sword by the High Elves, but what he had managed to salvage was the most important bit. The bit of the ship that had all the magic was the dragon's head of the Sea Fang, the bit that you feed blood to, and that's really the only bit of the ship that matters. So it's like, okay, we're going to go kill them. And he goes into full vengeance mode. He's like, okay, first things first, that bloody wizard, he's the first one who's on my death list. Let's get Sea Fang's dragon head to show us where he is. Let's feed it some blood. And they manage to escape from Ulthuan. And they get there and they land somewhere in the Empire. And they're like, oh, this is where he's from. Okay, I see what's happening here. I see what's happening here. He's a bloody wizard of the colleges of magic. He's from the civilized world. He's not even a Norscan. This is unforgivable. It's going to take an army for us to plow through the walls of this imperial city. Let's go get an army. Let's go home. Feeds the dragon head some more blood. They go back to Norska. So almost immediately upon arriving home, Wulfrik is looking for Svineborn. He's the first victim of his wrath. And in the sort of when he's going through town, he hears that Svineborn had in fact raped Hjodris, Svineborn's sister and Wulfrik's betrothed. Now Wulfrik this just kind of adds to Wulfrik's rage. And Wulfrik goes and finds Svineborn and doesn't take his sword to him, just starts to pummel him with his fists. And he's beating on Pyro, just raining down thunderous blows one after the other. Svineborn's face is kind of melting underneath the blows as the bones in his face begin to crack and crumble under the power of these unending, unceasing blows from Wulfrik. And after beating Svineborn within an inch of his life, Wulfrik's like, okay, that's enough. I'm just going to kill you now. And he pulls out a dagger and prepares to slit the Lord's throat. At this point, the Lord of the Sals comes in, Viglandir, Svineborn's father, and he says, Wulfrik, stop. Please don't kill him. We need him. And if you kill him, the Aelings will come and kill all of us, the Sals. They won't forgive you for killing 2 of their chiefs in a row. They won't forgive us and our people. If you kill him, you doom us all. And we don't have the funds we used to have. We wouldn't be able to fight them off like we did before. I mean, obviously you wouldn't necessarily be supporting us. So they'd wipe out our people if you kill him, Wulfrik. And if you don't kill him, we'll help you with whatever campaign or whatever you need. We'll give you everything you need. And Wulfrik was like, okay, I need an army that can raise an empire city, and I need it right now. So Viglandir said, okay, we'll give you an army, but you have to make me a promise. You'll have no more designs on being the king of the Sals, and you have to swear upon this axe of corn, which is a holy relic that the Sals had. So Wulfrik says, okay, I have no more desire to be king. You give me this army, I won't kill your son. That's the deal. Svineborn finally sort of manages to put himself together, and they sort of collect him up off the ground, and they like, okay, we'll both contribute towards this joint army to go and take this empire city so you can have your vengeance. So Wulfrik's like, okay, I need this army. Let's not kill Svineborn just yet. So they strike a bargain and they launch their campaign against the empire. And in the midst of this, Hjordis maybe tries to go up to Wulfrik, but he's like, no, girl, I'm sorry. You shouldn't have let yourself get raped. That's your fault. That's on you. I'm not really interested anymore, so you can F off, as it were. Which is a bit cold, but there's Wulfrik for you. He was just like, nah. You should have been a strong enough woman to fight him off or kill him. You shouldn't have let yourself get raped. Wulfrik doesn't really care about this girl anymore, and he knows that he's been betrayed by his own clan boss and this guy, but he also needs them to get vengeance on that bloody wizard who led to the death of his best mate. So he's like, okay, let's fight one of these demons at a time. Let's go for the wizard. Now, with the use of the Sea Fang and attaching ropes to other ships, they managed to completely circumvent the defenses of Marienburg and Nordland and begin their attack on what was known as the town of Wisborg in the province of Reichland. So he gets a massive army together with all the other Norskins with the help of his enemies, and he's like, okay, let's go. And they launch an attack. As a kind of last-minute gesture, Svineborn and his father had attempted to bribe a lot of the soldiers in this joint army to get them to turn on Wulfrik in the heat of the battle, and in exchange they would get a portion of the plunder they take from the Empire City. So they've managed to get all the way into the hinterland of the Empire, and they start to siege this town. Now it turns out Zarnaf's real name was Ludwig Stoessel. So the campaign goes through, the Norsemen manage to break through the walls with their immense numbers, they charge through, and Wulfrik, after fighting through the streets, taking down halberdiers, slashing militia, peasants, anyone who really stood in his way, he finally makes his way to Ludwig Stoessel, or Zarnaf as he knew him. Now, Zarnaf, being not a bad wizard, managed to summon a whole bunch of constructs to fight Wulfrik, but Wulfrik, being the badass that he is, just managed to smash them to smithereens. He finally managed to grab Stoessel and begins to carve open his chest, spread apart his ribcage, pull out his lungs one by one, and drape them over Stoessel's shoulder. This maneuver was known as the Blood Raven in the Warhammer world. In the real world, it was known as the Blood Eagle, and it was known as the torture of the Vikings. And that's how he killed him, by sort of tearing open his ribcage, putting his lungs over his shoulders, and having them represent kind of bloody wings. It's said that in the Warhammer world, the Blood Raven maneuver was invented by Valkia the Bloody, who'd introduced it to the realms of men and to the Norscan tribes. But it's one of the most ritualistic and horrific ways in which you can kill someone, and Wulfrik had been waiting a long time to get even with Zarnaf or Ludwig Stoessel or whatever the hell he called himself. Upon winning the day and getting access to all the loot and the plunder, Viglandir and Svineborn are expecting the army to turn on Wulfrik and kill him. But Wulfrik, knowing they were bound to betray him and knowing their true nature and knowing that they'd been trying to betray him all along, had told the soldiers, hey, soldiers, you're gonna obey me and you can have access to all of the gold. Unlike if you were doing a deal with your chieftains, who would only give you a partial amount of the gold, keeping the lion's share for themselves. I don't need any gold. You can have all of the gold as far as I'm concerned. And so the warriors never turned against Wulfrik. Now, Swineborn and Viglandia aren't necessarily sure that their men have turned against them, so they collect all the plunder, and they're on the return trip home on the Seafang, or on the special Chaos Winds realm, where the Seafang sails, rather than the physical world. And it's on the ship that Wulfrik kind of turns around and goes, Swineborn, I know what you've been doing, and already sort of suffering the savage beating he'd gotten from Wulfrik before. Swineborn sort of trembling in the corner and just like, oh, what are you talking about? I don't know. I know you tried to betray me yet again. This is it for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to raise your banner above my ship right now to make it look like you've defeated me, and then I'm going to abandon all of your troops in the warp, or in this magical realm, if you will. From then on, your name will be dirt in the eyes of Norskans everywhere. They will feel like you abandoned their men, you'll have no honor, you'll be scum, no one will accept you, you'll be banished, and that almost certainly in the northern lands means death for you eventually. And Swineborn is like, no, please, just of anything you want to do to me, hurt me, murder me, kill me, but leave me my honor and my family honor, please, don't, whatever you want. And Wulfrik takes him up on this offer. In fact, what he does is he grabs Swineborn by the jaw, forces open his mouth, and shoves a snake down his throat. Now, there's a lot of metaphorical imagery one could take from that, but let's take it literally, meaning he literally shoved a poisonous snake down Swineborn's mouth. And this was a horror sort of choking on his own blood and on the snake itself, and he eventually died and collapsed. Wulfrik chopped his head off. Eventually, Wulfrik gets back to Norska with the fleet, and he walks into the feast hall of Viglandia, throws his son's head at his feet, which had become swollen because of the poison and the venom of the snake that he'd shoved down his son's throat. And seeing this, Viglandia, the chief of the Scyles, is completely distraught. He's like, do you know what you've done, Wulfrik? You've damned us all. Even if you kill me now, all the Scyles will be wiped out by the Aelings. You've killed 2 of their chiefs now. They won't let this lie. They're honor bound to come and try and kill us all. And Wulfrik just acknowledges the fact that he knows this is the case. And he doesn't touch Viglandia. He just leaves him there. And Viglandia's like, no, please, you have to lead our armies. You have to help us defend against this onslaught that we're about to face. And he just keeps walking away. Eventually he shouts out, what about Hjordis? You loved her once, did you not? And Wulfrik pauses and just keeps walking. For little did Viglandia know that before he'd dropped off the head of his son at his feet, he'd gone and killed Hjordis, the princess, already. And Wulfrik just left the mewling, squealing chief in his hall and walked away from the city. Once he was a few miles out, he started to see the pillars of smoke rise from the capital of the Scyl chiefdom, and just kind of chuckled to himself, completely accepting his new fate to go around the world slaughtering anybody. Because as far as his ambitions were concerned, they were done. The princess was dead and had been besoiled before her death. The kingship was something he vowed on an artifact of corn that he never could take up, so that dream was dead to him, and he just sort of full-heartedly gave himself to the role of the duelist, the killer of champions that the Chaos Gods had made him. And he walked into the mountains, and to this day he's just carrying out the will of the gods, facing down the champions they sent him to with the use of his trusty ship Seafang, and just murdering his way around the world. And that's the story of Wulfrik the Wanderer. Doomed his own people to a horrible death, never fulfilled his dreams and ambitions, but one of the best warriors in the Warhammer world, and a hell of a murderous, merciless bastard. Wulfrik the Wanderer. In terms of how Wulfrik will play on Total War Warhammer, it has been speculated in a couple of places that Wulfrik might become a Norscan leader of sorts, a Norscan tribal leader, so you can play as a faction of Norska. I think that'd be kind of a waste, not necessarily a waste, but I'd like to see him have access to more stuff than just the Norscan armies. I'd like to see him have some hell cannon and stuff like that. And he is a champion of the Chaos Gods, so don't necessarily make him a Norscan faction, although I get the argument. Make him have huge amounts of buffs to Marauders. Make him make Marauders as good as Chaos Warriors, or as good as maybe even Chosen, but Get him to give massive buffs to Marauders and Marauder Horsemen and all Marauder units on the campaign map. I think that's what you'd have to do with Wulfrik. In terms of his rule on the tabletop, he had a couple of special rules. One was the Gift of Tongues, which essentially allowed him to issue a challenge. Now in the tabletop, once you issued a challenge and the challenge has been accepted, that you guys are locked in combat. So it's a good way of like picking out special characters, killing them separately from the unit-on-unit combat, and it was a particularly effective tool if used correctly. Now, I'm not sure how that mechanic could potentially translate to Total War Warhammer, because the Gift of Tongues essentially meant that because Wulfrik could speak in any language, he could essentially insult you in the most profane ways, and he was kind of had this particular insight into cultural insults and to insults that would really just irk you to such a way that if he challenged, no one could turn it down. Now, there's a couple of ways that could play out in the Total War Warhammer series. One way, which is probably the easiest way for them to do, is maybe just have that be a buff on him in terms of his melee attack, the Gift of Tongues, to make him sort of just give him a boost to attack to make him kill people more effectively. But a much cooler mechanic that I would just love to see, and would be cheesy as hell, would be literally the Gift of Tongues, and within a certain range, Wulfrik selects an enemy character, and that character immediately charges towards Wulfrik. It overrides any commands and can't be commanded until it's dead or Wulfrik's dead, or maybe just lasts for a particular amount of time. That would be fascinating to see. If you could yell at Grimgor from across the battlefield and Grimgor comes up to Wulfrik and tries to take him on in a battle, and the other player just can't control him for a certain amount of time because all he's doing is running towards Wulfrik, that would be a very cool mechanic and a real true interpretation of the lore and an interpretation of the tabletop game as well, but could be horrifically cheesy and could lead to just a new kind of Lord snipering, where you just get the Lord to charge across the battlefield from a certain distance away towards Wulfrik, then just ambush him with all your own characters. But it would be kind of cool to see. So that'd be my preferred implementation of the Gift of Tongues. Another special rule he had was the Hunter of Champions rule, which essentially gave him a 2+ strength bonus and a chance to reroll hits. So essentially the way that will translate to Total War Warhammer is a buff to weapon strength and a buff to melee attack. So that would be a fairly easy enough buff to translate. You could do it for him or for an aura effect as well. Now he also had the Seafang special rule, which is essentially the idea that he can, with a group of Marauders, if he's embedded with a unit of Marauders, be kind of put anywhere on the battlefield, I think, kind of like a teleportation thing. Like, so you can essentially encircle enemy units and stuff like that. Now, the way that this kind of battlefield mobility stuff has been translated in Total War Warhammer so far is that usually they just give the unit Vanguard. So it'd be quite interesting to see Wulfrik, who could give all Marauder units Vanguard. I think that would be pretty cool as a bonus. I'd also like to see Seafang have some effects on the campaign map. My idea is, because Wulfrik can essentially transport himself anywhere in the world, is that you actually maybe allow that mechanic to come into Total War Warhammer, not like an underground route system, but a system by which, if he does travel by Seafang to anywhere he wants in the world on the coast, because it is a boat, don't forget, then all of his troops suffer attrition. Now, you could scale it to the further away he goes, the more attrition he takes, and that attrition could be symbolic of the blood sacrifice they have to make to the ship itself when they want to travel with her. So that would be my idea. Give them a turn of attrition and allow them to kind of teleport from coastal line to coastal line around the Total War Warhammer world. I think that would be a really cool mechanic and really represent the power of the Seafang and why it would be such an important quest item for Wulfrik the Wanderer to get. And that about sums it up for Wulfrik the Wanderer. Moving on, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but Vilitch the Curseling? Vilitch the Curseling, or otherwise known as the Twisted Twin, was not always a singular entity, as the name kind of implies. In fact, Vilitch was one of two twins. It was Vilitch and his twin brother, Tommen. Now, when Tommen was born, he was a strapping, healthy baby, but Vilitch, when he was born, was this kind of meager, tiny, ill-looking child. Their mother went through a very difficult childbirth and died promptly after their birth. Now, growing up, Tommen, who was the stronger baby, grew up to be quite a decent warrior. He wasn't necessarily a nice person. He would often beat and sort of torture his smaller brother whenever he sort of disobeyed their father, or just when he felt like beating the hell out of something. So Vilitch was very much sort of put upon. He was ordered around. Growing up, Tommen was able to go and sort of train to be a warrior. He was left to take over the chores of his dead mother and just sort of look after the house. Eventually, as they grew into men, Tommen joined the elite ranks of his clan's warriors, whereas Vilitch, although not necessarily doing his mother's chores anymore, had become kind of a piss-poor apprentice to the village shaman. He really couldn't do magic very well and was just kind of a bit rubbish at it all around. But the shaman apprenticeship was the only real thing he showed any kind of talent at, what little talent there was. So having led this kind of horrible life where he's constantly beaten by his father and brother, and he never gets acknowledged by the people of the village, and all the praise seems to go towards his brother, and he curses the way he was born and the life he's living. So every night he'd get down and he'd pray to the chaos god Vilitch. And he'd just pray to reverse the fates of him and his twin brother. He's like, please give me all of my brother's gifts and leave him to be the weakling and the horrific one. And this is always a word I destroy, so I apologize already to any of my German viewers, but on the eve of Gehemmenschnatt, which is the eve of the time when the Chaos Moon, which is the green moon of the Warhammer world, and the regular moon, which is comparable to our moon, are in the sky at the same time. It happens once a year in the Warhammer world. Vilitch was like, okay, I like a bit of chaos and anarchy. Let's kind of grant his wish, but not quite. And upon waking up that morning, Vilitch had found himself attached to his brother in this horrific way you see in the model. What had happened is his intellect had essentially been doubled overnight, his brother's strength had taken on a kind of demonic quality, and he'd taken on all his brother's intellect as well as his own, making him much brighter than he was the night before. His brother, however, had become this kind of drooling monstrosity that obeyed Vilitch's commands, but really had little functioning attributes beyond that. Vilitch would say, go kill that, and he could kind of understand that, but he was unable to communicate and had become this kind of drooling mess. So Vilitch, having found his intellect doubled, found his gift with magic improved 100-fold. He was a much better sorcerer than he'd ever been, and he was now attached to this hulking monstrosity. Realizing his new power and gifts, he set about just completely killing everyone in the village. He was like, you were mean to me once. Remember when you threw that rock at me when I was a kid? You're dead. Kill him, bro. Sword through the skull. You once looked at me funny and called me ugly. You're dead. You're a guy who I've never met before, but you're dead too. There we go. Let's go for it. Everyone's dying. Now at the time, most of the village's elite warriors were out doing something else. They were out facing a foe, defending their lands. And so Vilitch was kind of free to just slaughter the entire town. And by the end of it, with him firing out like lightning bolts of changing magic energy, and his brother's body just hacking and slashing away with any tools he could, and without having any weapons, even just throttling anyone who came close to try and kill Vilitch, they just formed a horrific combination. And it's said that essentially they were just standing in pools of molten flesh at the end of it, and they'd killed everyone in the entire town. Not wanting to end things there, not feeling vengeance was satisfied from the village for giving him a hard life at that point, he then went to find the elite warriors of his village. Upon finding these elite warriors, he enslaved them with his new magic and made them essentially as dumb and as obedient as his brother. So this is kind of the unit he rocks around with, is the idea that he rocks around with this unit of elite warriors from his old village who he's enslaved for mocking him as a child or for mocking him throughout his adult life. And he has his brother who he's attached to but has still in some ways enslaved, and thus has become Vilitch the Curseling, the champion of Vilitch. Now, I don't think we'll see Vilitch until the introduction of the 4 different Chaos Gods, because he has the law magic of Vilitch, and that in itself, I don't think we'll see introduced until the 3rd iteration of the game, where Creative Assembly are said to be planning to split the Chaos faction into the factions of the 4 Chaos Gods. I doubt we'll be seeing him anytime soon, but we can hope. I think he'd make a horrific looking monstrosity in Total War Warhammer, and he might be a half-decent magic lord, which Total War Warhammer is sadly lacking at the moment. But look forward to seeing him. It's quite a horrific origin story, but there you go. That is Vilitch the Curseling. Moving on, we have Festus the Leech Lord. Now, Festus, as you can see, is one disgusting mofo, but he didn't always look like this. Festus actually started life out as a doctor in the Empire. He was a doctor in Nordland, and he liked to help people and cure a lot of diseases. He was actually very well recognized within the Empire and had stopped a number of different plagues, including the plague of ghoulpox, this screaming ague. But he met his demise when a plague of gnashing fever struck Nordland. Having sort of conquered all these plagues, he'd grown something of an ego, and he really thought he could cure any diseases, and he really had built himself up in his own mind to be able to do this, and he should be able to help people, and he should be able to use his intellect to be able to fight these diseases and conquer them. But this gnashing fever was just killing droves and droves of people. Over the course of his career, he opened up a number of hospitals, and he used one of these hospitals to kind of barricade himself in with all the sufferers of this disease and tried to quarantine them to a certain degree, and was working furiously away within his lab to come up with some kind of poultice or some potion to cure the disease. And one after another, his patients kept dying, just dropping, and it started to get to him, and eventually when he lost his last patients, he collapsed and shouted to the heavens, please just give me the knowledge to cure this horrific disease. I'll do anything at all. Now Nurgle, that horrible pus magnet that he is, heard this shout and was like, I see a fantastic opportunity here. So he made Festus agree to serve him for the rest of his life, and in exchange, Nurgle would give him the knowledge to be able to cure every disease Nurgle knew of, so every disease in the universe essentially, and all that knowledge would be his, and he could finally become the doctor he always wanted to be and fight any disease he could. Upon hearing this offer, Festus was like, yes, if I can help people, that'd be wonderful, for his compassion was matched only by sort of the depths of his intellect, and he took the deal. And then suddenly he just had a searing pain in his head as all the knowledge of all these diseases entered his mind, and eventually it drove him to a point of madness. He couldn't handle all this information at once. And it said in this madness, all the compassion that used to be the foundation of Dr. Festus's character burnt away, and all that was left was the knowledge of disease he had and his willingness to experiment. And thus Festus the Leech Lord was born. Festus just spends his time looking for experimentation subjects, looking to create new vile and horrific things, and his compassion for people has died away. He's not looking to cure, although he has the ability to cure and to heal. His main passion is looking for more subjects for his experiments, and that's kind of how he spends his time wandering the world, forcefully experimenting on people as a servant of Nurgle. Now, in terms of how he might be implemented in Total War Warhammer, Festus has a couple of special rules. He has Nurgle magic, so much like some of the other lords, he may not be introduced until the third iteration of Total War Warhammer, when they split the Chaos faction into 4 factions of the 4 Chaos gods. But he has a couple of other special rules apart from the Nurgle magic. He has the Harbinger of Pestilence. Now, what that would do is essentially give any unit he was in poison, and he has poison attacks himself. So we've seen poison in Total War Warhammer, we know what that would look like, that's how that would be implemented. He'd have poison attacks, he'd maybe have a similar ability to Helman Gorst, in that he would give his entire army poison. I think that would be a good fit for Festus the Leech Lord. He also has an ability, because he can cure disease and can cure wounds, and despite the fact he's kind of a walking pustule of disease himself, can allow for regeneration. So he himself regenerates, and he should be able to cast regeneration on nearby units, I think, as well. So maybe have that be an aura effect, like an aura buff, so when any units are near him, he can pop that ability. He also had a special rule called Pestilent Potions, where if you were a friendly unit, you'd kind of roll a dice, and if you rolled a certain number, like high or low, you'd be able to regen a friendly unit or harm an enemy unit. Now, I think this could be an aura effect that could sort of team up with his own regen, and really maybe just be his regen effect, where you'd hit it and it would cause damage to the enemy and regen your guys. I think that's what his aura buff would be, and that would kind of match up what his rules were on the tabletop. The idea behind Pestilent Potion was that with all his like concoctions and stuff, in the midst of battle, if he had a friendly unit, he'd give them potions to heal themselves, and if he came across enemy units, he'd grab them and force feed them potions as experiments, which would cause them harm and cause them wounds, thus hurting the enemy unit. That's kind of the idea of Festus the Leech Lord and that special rule. But he is horrific, and I think they could do some fantastic things with him on Total War Warhammer. But but because of how disgusting a lot of the Chaos Gods are, I wonder how far they're going to take it in terms of the age restriction of Total War Warhammer, and whether there's maybe a kind of disgusting pack they might sell instead of the Blood Pack when they release the 4 different Chaos God factions. But that's something we'll have to wait and see for quite a while, I imagine. But looking forward to seeing Festus, Leech Lord, in Total War Warhammer at some point. Next we have Throgg. Now, Throgg, it would be easy for Total War to implement. You'd essentially take a troll, make him spikier, give him a mallet, done. Now, well known in the Warhammer world is the fact that trolls are idiots. Any dim-witted child knows that trolls just have a kind of bestial intelligence and can't do math, can't really do any kind of complicated thought. But there is a rumor that there is a troll in the northern parts of the world with a unique kind of malevolent cunning who can think and strategize and plot. And this individual is said to be called Throgg, the Troll King. And Throgg makes his kingdom in the northern wastes of the old world. Court is not made out of mewling politicians or petty knights, but of bestial trolls who obey Throgg at his beck and whim. Now, Throgg himself sits upon a rocky throne amidst a labyrinth of icy caverns that are strewn with the bodies of human challengers who have come to challenge Throgg over the years and if not the centuries. Now, Throgg himself was perfectly content to live out his life in his northern realms, ruling over his troll brethren and whoever else happened to fall into his territory. But year after year, champions of men, hearing the stories of Throgg, travel to the northern wastes looking to challenge the king of the trolls. Inevitably, they meet a grisly end, and more often than not, end up in the belly of the trolls, or indeed the Troll King himself. One such unlucky individual was once wearing what has become known as the Wintertooth crown, and upon gobbling him down, the crown got caught on one of Throgg's tusks and has been lodged there ever since. Eventually, Throgg's patience began to run out. He began to tire of his peace and his kingdom being invaded year after year by these silly, stupid humans. And so, as of these current Warhammer timeline, he said enough is enough. And Throgg has taken to calling to him all of the trolls and monsters and beasts within his kingdom, and has sworn on the dark gods to purge the lands of the kingdoms of men just because they've ticked him off that much and they just won't leave him alone. So he is going to murder all of them. So he's called to himself this massive horde of monsters and has begun his march south to raid the Empire. Yeah, that's kind of where Throgg is in the current Warhammer timeline. And he has a couple of pretty interesting special rules. Of course, he is a troll. He causes fear. He has a rule called Copious Vomit, where his vomit attack is particularly strong. Now, it's described as a breath weapon on the tabletop game. Now, I don't understand why they haven't implemented breath weapons for living creatures yet in Total War Warhammer. It can't be that hard a mechanic. The rings, there's a number of rings and special magic items in Total War Warhammer that allow you short-range breath attacks. So why you can't adapt that to make it a breath weapon for both dragons and potentially for Throgg as well is beyond me. But Throgg essentially has this breath weapon that's his vomit, and as you may know, troll vomit is acidic and can kind of burn away armor and is a horrific thing to have poured upon you. So that's a breath weapon he should have, and I think they should implement it the same way they implement the breath weapon rings. So it's a small radius around him that he can fire it in, and it fires out like that. And imagine him just sort of projectile vomiting acid upon all these units, and it would be armor piercing as well, so you wouldn't be able to make an armor save against it, and that could be a potentially devastating attack against the right opponents. Another rule of his is Lord of the Monstrous Horde, which on the tabletop would mean that Throgg can count trolls, which are usually a rarer unit, as a core unit, which just means he could take more, he could essentially take an entire army of trolls. Now, what this would translate as in Total War Warhammer, we've seen it similarly before, is essentially cost reduction in trolls in an army, and maybe a number of buffs to trolls in his upgrade tree. Now, the thing about Throgg is he would be one of the easiest to implement in Total War Warhammer as it stands currently, because you just have to make a unique model for him, but then all the rules are there. It's not about, he doesn't have anything unique to one of the Chaos Gods, so there's no lore of a particular magic. So I think Throgg is one of the more likely ones to turn up in any sort of updates that are coming up soon or in the near future for Total War Warhammer. We're likely to see him along with perhaps Wulfrik the Wanderer fairly soon, I'd imagine, because he would be one of the easiest to implement. And his other ability is the Wintertooth Crown, which is the crown, as you can see on his tooth there, that he got caught when he was eating some lordly prince or other. Now, what this crown does on tabletop is it gives a leadership bonus to any monsters or monstrous infantry or beasts within his army. And essentially I think it should do the same thing, but it would be kind of an army-wide campaign buff where the leadership for trolls, if you could make trolls unbreakable, that would be a little bit OP even necessarily with Throgg, but that would be pretty cool to see. But essentially a leadership buff for trolls and monstrous creatures, as well as buffs within his upgrade chain I'd like to see for monstrous creatures themselves. I think that'd be really cool. And a really unique thing for the Chaos armies as well, because there's not a lot of incentive to use like the Gore-Beast chariots necessarily, or the trolls, because some of the Chaos infantry itself can do the job. You don't really need a lot of those monstrous things. But to have a complete army of monsters in Total War Warhammer as it stands now for Chaos would be something very unique and something that would be, I imagine, quite easy to implement. So I hope CA get on this one quite quickly. It just seems like a no-brainer. Seems like one of the easiest and quickest ones for them to implement. So looking forward to hopefully seeing Throgg in the near future for Chaos. Next up, we have Scyla and Fingrim. Now, Scyla didn't start life as the monstrosity you see before you, but he actually started life as a man, as a Norscan soldier, and he actually was the leader of a tribe known as the Ironpelt tribe. Now, the Ironpelt tribe were kind of close relations to the Greylings, as you may have seen in the Total War Warhammer map in your campaign. He was off sort of gallivanting around the world when a fleet of the Greyling sort of raiders hadn't returned from their summer of raiding to the village. And the village was a little bit concerned at this, and they kind of went out to investigate and discovered that there was a huge sea monster just destroying their ship whenever it came across them. And so they retreated and they put out a call and they prayed to their gods, and eventually they prayed to Khorne, and Khorne said to them, Okay, you guys, I'll help you out. I'm not going to send a champion or defeat the monster myself. I will give you guys this obsidian tusk that is a marker of whoever bears it, whoever earns it, will earn my favor for the rest of their lives. I will look out for them. Don't worry, Papa Khorne got your back if they manage to kill this sea monster of yours. So that's the reward you can offer the champions of the local tribe to try and kill this sea monster. Now, a number of champions tried this, and the sea monster just kept killing every single one of them. And it was just a novella. It seemed like a hopeless situation. It seemed like the main sort of thoroughfare of economy of raiding and conquering and pillaging had been taken away from the clan, and they were going to go destitute and die and just lose power and influence throughout the entirety of Norsca. They couldn't like have access to the seas because their seas were just being perpetually hounded by this bloody monster. Now, Scyla, who had been away raiding himself, but not near the lands where the monster had been, eventually got home and got word that this fantastic gift was on offer for whoever managed to slay this sea monster. Now, he'd already earned a huge reputation. He was only sort of around 25 years old, already chief of his clan, already champion of his clan, and he was an arrogant chap. So he was like, hey, I can take down a sea monster. So he turns up at the Greyling village, and is like, or Greyling sort of main village, and is like, okay, I'm here to claim the prize. And like, all right, we've had a lot of champions. You're just another one in town. Off you go. Kind of like a sort of semi-Beowulf situation. And okay, but we've kind of run out of boats at this point to send you out, and all we've got is this kind of rickety old sort of rowboat with a single little sail on it. You can kind of take that out, but it won't help you out fighting a sea monster. And he was like, psh, I'll fight him on this rowboat, no problem at all. So Scyla sets off in hunt of this monster. He's got his greatsword by his side, that's his weapon of choice, and off he goes into the open ocean. Now, it takes him a couple of days of sailing around before he finally encounters it. And what he encounters is this huge serpentine tentacle rising from above the water. And he is like, oh my god, what a monstrosity. This will be a battle that we'll sing about for ages. And with a single mighty swipe, he chops down the tentacle. And he's like, haha, sea monster defeated. It will surely just bleed to death in the waters below me. I've got it. Let's go back and claim my reward. But then 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 tentacles just start rising out of the water, towering above him like skyscrapers, and they're all set to come crashing down on his rickety little boat. And indeed they do, but he's sort of jumping and darting around the place, stabbing the tentacles, using the sword to gain grip and stay above the water, jumping on the sort of bits of driftwood that have become his boat, and just trying to keep afloat and just do horrific battle with this monster. And he's doing it harm, but it's just too big. He can't find a vulnerable spot, a single killing blow to kill it. And eventually the monster starts to submerge, and he's like, oh god, I don't have a boat, it's trying to run away, I've kind of wounded it, but I haven't killed it, this isn't good enough to get the token of corn. So he grabs a chain with a hook on it that he's had in the boat, or that's sinking in the boat, and he manages to dive and grab it and fling it at the monster, and he manages to hook it under one of its sort of armored plates and grab it and get a purchase. And the monster at this point is like, okay, that hurt. It was kind of like being attacked by maybe a very angry bee. It was just like, okay, that hurt. I'm just going to go and maybe sort of nurse my sort of scrapes and bruises that this bloody git gave me. So it's swimming along, and unbeknownst to it, it's dragging him along with it. And it's said to have dragged him through the freezing oceans of Norska for a day and a half. But sheer through will and stamina, Scyla managed to hang on. And eventually the monster went into this kind of sheltered cove on the coastline. Exhausted and near freezing to death, Scyla manages to pull himself ashore without the monster necessarily noticing him. And he sees the monster's like slightly pull itself out of the water more than he'd seen of it before, and kind of crawl into this watery cave that it seems to dwell in and call her home. And it's said that when Scyla saw the creature, he saw a kind of humanish aspect to it, maybe suggesting that at one time this monster had been human but had been kind of cursed stroke blessed by the Chaos Gods and turned into this monstrosity itself. And eventually Scyla manages to warm himself up and recover from being dragged through the ocean for about 2 days and starts to form a plan. Now he knows where the creature lives, and eventually come the next morning the creature gets out of its cave and goes back to the open ocean to hunt and kill and eat. So Scyla thinking, okay, I have a plan here. I know its nest. I'm going to crawl into its nest and lay ambush with it. And in its nest there are all these bones of different creatures, and he manages to make a kind of bone spear out of the remains of what was left in the nest of this huge sea monster. Upon its return that evening, Scyla, sort of being submerged sort of slightly in the very shallow watery cave, dived out from his hiding spot and managed to skewer the beast in its underbelly, piercing vital organs and finally dealing a killing blow. Many days later, once Scyla managed to find a way to return to the Norscan people, he sort of barged into the Greyling main hall with the eye of the beast upon his bone spear, and covered in just the black blood that the beast had sort of spewed all over him as he'd inflicted this grievous wound upon it. So he made a horrific sight walking into this feast hall. He goes, there you go. Can I have my prize, please? And indeed, he was awarded the obsidian tusk, and this gave him the blessing of the god Khorne. So Khorne always looked out for Scyla after that and kept an eye on him, and should he earn it, would be happy to bestow blessings upon him. So Scyla, jazzed up by this, jazzed up by his growing reputation as a monster slayer, started going around the world looking for new challenges to sort of satiate his bloodlust that he'd had ever since. And one of his first things is he was said to have gone and tackled a Jabberslife along the Voltag River, and eventually traveling the world, he encountered the Skaven city of Gulch, I think it's called. And it's kind of a city built in a deep kind of ravine or crevice. And he charged down there and just started slaughtering the rat men, crushing their skulls with his bare hands, hacking at them with axe and sword, and just causing a complete torrent of blood that started to flow down this chasm that he was fighting all these Skaven in. Upon seeing this, Khorne was like, that's my boy, good job, buddy, and is said to have bestowed him with the blessing of great strength. This gave him this huge musculature and almost ape-like arms that he has, and he became one of the strongest champions of the time, having got this blessing from Khorne. Taking this blessing, his bloodlust only increased. He started looking for more and more challenges. Eventually he traveled as far south as Araby and started setting ablaze the fleet of the Arabian sultans and taking down their flagship. Having seen this, Khorne was like, still doing a great job, buddy. Here's another blessing, and gave him the blessing of his serpent-like tail and gnashing maw with the teeth at the end of it. Again, and still not being satisfied, Scyla sets off trying to kill more things, and eventually he comes across the Chaos Dwarves, and he slaughters a trade caravan, because the Chaos Dwarves were often known to trade with Norsca, trading sort of captives and slaves for black sort of steel plate and enchanted Chaos Dwarf items. So, having just slaughtered a trade caravan for no apparent reason, Khorne is like, oh man, your bloodlust is off the hook. Have some more blessings for me. Let's see what we can do with you. How much of a killing machine can you become? And he bestows on him the gift of the horn-like plates, the kind of plated armor and horn-like tusks that emerge from his neck area and his shoulders and his arms to make him a better killing machine. And eventually he sets upon the mountains where he encounters a colony of Gorgers. Now, if you don't know what Gorgers are, in the Ogre Kingdoms, when babies are born weak or without a beer belly, which is weird as considered a weakness because it dishonors their god, they take them and they throw them in these caves, like as a kind of human sacrifice, kind of like the Spartan way of just killing off weak babies. But these babies, some of these babies, despite all odds, managed to survive and then lived out these caves and had become these kind of feral, crazed, massive creatures known as Gorgers. Now, upon encountering a colony of Gorgers, Scyla, with his new strength and tail and spikes, set about just slaughtering an entire colony of the mutant ravenous beasts and just completely annihilated them. And Khorne was like, oh my word, son. You are doing good. You don't need this kind of human intellect you have. Have the kind of drive and bloodlust of just a ravenous monster. And he gifts him with that. And then you start to have the creature we see before us today, this kind of crazed beast of Khorne, almost like an ultimate hound of Khorne, if you will. And indeed, eventually this kind of brass collar started to emerge from the sinew of his muscle with the sigil of Khorne itself that had been gifted to him by the god. And so Scyla had become kind of this living embodiment of a Khorne flesh hound given life in the sort of body of a human as a kind of a chaos spawn. And no longer could he really lead the people of the Iron Pelt because he didn't really think as a human anymore. He just kind of a killing machine, but not to the point where he'd kill his own people. He could still kind of be guided, kind of like Incredible Hulk kind of intelligence. Let's go for that kind of level of just like smash eat but not smash eat friend kind of thing. One of his like old lieutenants, a chap called One-Eyed Urlock, took over the Iron Pelt tribe, but they would often go to war with Scyla himself. And they encountered an Empire army in the year 2298 of the Imperial calendar, so about 200 years before the current Total War Warhammer timeline. But in the Chaos Waste, time can get a bit funny, so don't take that as meaning he's necessarily died of old age or anything by the time Total War Warhammer comes about. But they're said to have unleashed him upon an entire Empire army, and he by himself slaughtered every single one of them. Now, the problem with Scyla as necessarily a legendary lord is that he couldn't really be a legendary lord. Now, we still haven't seen any legendary heroes as of yet. Like, he doesn't have the mental capacity to lead an army as such. But you never know, they might just find their way around that law to some degree. Now, Scyla himself on the tabletop was essentially just an attacking machine, a complete attacking monster. He had fear and often had the rule of hatred, which would give him an extra ability to attack. The amount of attacks he had could be up to 12 attacks, which is huge on the tabletop game. He rolled 2 dice and it was kind of randomly set. But essentially he'd be like the ultimate frenzy monster attacker, but as a hero. So kind of imagine a hero Vargulf, that kind of thing. He'd have to be at that kind of level. He does have a special magic item though, which is that collar that said that the law's changed a little bit. Some places in the law, in the old way, I think the old law said that Urlock, his lieutenant, who's now the chief of his clan, put it on him. And some say he grew it out of his own muscle, which I think is the current law. Khorne helped him grow it out of his own muscle. But the collar itself offers a ward save, so we've seen that in Total War Warhammer. And it offers magic resistance, so that would be his magic item. But as I said, he'd really lore-wise have to be a hero rather than necessarily a general, but you could fudge it and make him a hero. But I'm just saying, he is a mindless killing machine, and it's kind of hard to organize an army around a mindless killing machine. So we'll wait and see, but I think he is horrific looking. In his older iterations, he looked more kind of dog-like, as you see here. And that's his ex-lieutenant, now chief of the clan, Urlock One-Eye, next to him there. But these were kind of his old iterations and old illustrations of him. And you can see he's a bit more bestial, less sort of ape or human looking. And he's just a complete animal and should just be a complete melee beast. Maybe low armor. Well, no, he does have the armor plate, so low armor wouldn't even be his weakness. Don't know what his weakness would be, but he'd just have to be a killing machine in Total War Warhammer. And I think they could make a model that would look amazing for him. So I look forward to seeing Scyla and Fingrim in Total War Warhammer. Moving on, we have Galrauch. Now, Galrauch wouldn't take that much effort for Creative Assembly to implement in Total War Warhammer, because effectively they already have kind of the two-headed Chaos Dragon. Increase that size by 20%, maybe change his color palette a little bit, give him a couple of breath weapons, and you have Galrauch, really. But in terms of his origin, Galrauch wasn't always the two-headed monstrosity we see before us here. Now, Galrauch has been around for a very long time. He's first noted in the histories as being around with the High Elves in the age of Anarion. Now, Anarion was, I believe, the first Phoenix King of the High Elves, and that would place him on the battlefield with the High Elves around the year -4498 of the Imperial calendar. So around 7,000 years before the current Total War Warhammer timeline is when Galrauch was just a normal dragon, a dragon who fought alongside the High Elves. Now, at the time, the High Elves were dealing with the first Chaos invasions, when Chaos was first introduced to the Warhammer world, and were just everywhere, and there were demons everywhere, and it was just chaos, and the High Elves were fighting off this huge invasion. Now, one of the best weapons the High Elves had were their dragon allies who would fight alongside them, and the Chaos armies really had no answer for the dragons. They would just annihilate huge swathes of Chaos armies at one time. And the only answer the Chaos could really come up with was demons, and the sort of greater demons, or the demon princes. And they would engage in these huge epic duels with dragons during this time period that would just be written into legends for ages. And they would often pair off against each other and just fight for days on end when these battles would happen. Now, it was during one of these battles where Galrauch had encountered a demon known as Fateclaw, the Lord of Change. And they engaged in this sort of epic fight, and eventually Galrauch swooped down from on high, ready to lunge at the demon's head, and the demon, not seeming to give a care or dodge or move or anything, simply sort of opened up his pointed needle-like teeth in a cringe-inducing grin as Galrauch swooped down and bit off his head. The demon's body then evaporated into some kind of mist and seemed to penetrate Galrauch himself. Now, Galrauch not entirely sure what happened, but still reveling in his victory over this demon, sort of took high into the sky, met by the cheers of his High Elf allies, thinking he'd triumph. But suddenly he froze in midair, and the body of the great dragon started to convulse and twist, and his scales started to shimmer and move and become corrupted and change their hue. And eventually, most horrifically of all, the dragon's mighty head split in two, and each of these two halves sealed themselves after each other, and they split all the way down his neck to his body, forming these two distinct heads. And indeed, Galrauch had become completely corrupted by the essence of chaos and had become a monstrosity, a perversion of his former self. And this perversion, this two-headed corrupted dragon, began to attack his former allies, the elves, and they started to scream in terror. But eventually, the will of Fateclaw, who'd obviously enveloped and inhabited Galrauch's body, was partially fought back by the spirit of Galrauch, which still lived within this corrupted body. He could still impose his will to a certain degree, and he managed to take over one of the heads of his body and fight the other, delaying the thing he had become enough for the High Elves to finish fighting off the Chaos Horde and win the day. But Galrauch himself survived in this new being, his will constantly fighting with that of Fateclaw, who'd inhabited him. Now, most of the time, Fateclaw is the one in charge of the body, but from time to time, Galrauch's spirit of old can still fight through and take over at least one of the heads, if not the body in its entirety. But for the most part, Galrauch is considered the first ever Chaos Dragon, and all Chaos Dragons from since then have been spawned of him. After that initial defeat, Galrauch is said to have sort of flown off and slept for a number of centuries. He has popped up from time to time, most notably killing King Fargrim Rockarm and ruining the town of Longueur de Lac, and he does sort of kind of just pitch up from time to time out of the blue, rain down chaos on the civilized worlds of, on the civilizations of the of the Warhammer world and then disappear again for a number of centuries. Now, in terms of the tabletop and his implementation in Total War Warhammer, I actually see Galrauch being implemented in the second iteration of the game, along with the implementation of the High Elves. I think he will be the Chaos champion that the High Elves have to fight. And as I said, quite easy to do. They've already kind of modeled and animated the two-headed dragons in Total War Warhammer, make a bigger one, and change its color hue a bit, and you've got Galrauch. And I've mentioned this before with in terms of breath weapons. Galrauch has 2 breath weapons, and we've seen breath magic and kind of breath weapons being implemented in Total War Warhammer, but I don't think we've seen them applied to dragons as of yet. So you could apply them to him as his special weapon, really. Much like the ring the dwarves get, that fire ring, have that be one of his attacks, which is a fire attack that he has, and his other head spews out this kind of magic mist, and that's said to sort of cause damage. That can maybe do more magical damage than necessarily physical burning damage. That could be the idea behind that. But have them be just 2 alternative weapons, breath weapons he can use, much like breath magic, but that you can't, that it doesn't have much range. It has to be kind of near his body, near him, when he casts it. So that would be how you would implement Galrauch. As I say, I would love to see him appear with the second iteration of the game as the Chaos Lord who invades Ulthuan, and the dwarves and the elves have to fight off. I think that's when we'll see him, because he does have that history of the elves, of essentially being one of the sort of high elf dragons, and then being corrupted by chaos and falling away. So I think, and plus he can fly, so the fact that Ulthuan's an island shouldn't really bother him at all. So that's how I like to see Galrauch implemented. He did have a, like a horrific looking model, I can't tell if it's really good or really bad, the model he used to have on the tabletop. But it kind of gets across that kind of horrific nature his skin took on, and the kind of form he takes nowadays. And apart from the breath weapon, another special rule he had was the fighting spirit of Galrauch, which is this idea I mentioned where Galrauch, the spirit of the old dragon that's been corrupted by chaos, is still in there somewhere. It's still fighting against this Fate Claw who seems to have taken over his body. And from time to time on the tabletop, you'd have to roll every turn of Galrauch's, and he would sometimes, and if he failed this I think it was a leadership test, he couldn't necessarily move for that turn, because the idea is that he's fighting within his own mind against the spirit of the old dragon he used to be. And so the heads turn against each other and start to snap and fight against each other. So I think a cool thing about that would be, maybe, I don't know how you do it. It'd be it's essentially a debuff that would occur at random. So maybe every time he casts the breath weapon, the idea would be that the miscast of the breath weapon wouldn't just damage him, but he also wouldn't be able to move for a certain amount of time. And that could be the implementation of this spirit of Galrauch, with him fighting amongst himself. So there's already a random chance in miscasting. If you put that random chance in every time he used one of the breath weapons, that's a good way to show the tabletop rule in Total War Warhammer, and kind of a good way to have that implemented. But that really sums it up for Galrauch. He does have sort of scaly skin, which essentially is an armor buff as well, but a cool ex-high elf dragon that's just been corrupted by chaos and become the first chaos dragon, mightiest of all chaos dragons. And he doesn't need a rider, he has intelligence in his own right, so he would just go around rampaging and be a pretty cool legendary lord for chaos. But as I say, I suspect we may see him on Ulthuan, along with maybe Grom the Paunch, the greenskin, because they have histories on Ulthuan, and they'd be good to see them implemented in that part of the world. And now, last but by no means least, we have Valkia the Bloody. Valkia the Bloody, the bringer of glory, or the Gore Queen, wasn't always as she looks today. She actually started out as a Norscan princess. She was the daughter of King Merrick, and eventually King Merrick passed away, but Valkia had been such a honorable warrior as a shield maiden in Merrick's army that she'd earned the right to take over as ruler of their Norscan tribe. And because she was a woman, she saw many male challenges. There is this idea in Norsca of the kind of challenge the right to rule, and you just meet each other in single combat and you can maybe take over the tribe that way. But challenger after challenger underestimated Valkia because she was a woman, and they thought they could easily defeat her and take over her tribe, but she would kill every single one of them. She'd become a truly skilled fighter in her time, and despite the fact that people constantly underestimated her, she would take heads with the best of them. Now, after a number of years of sort of killing any challengers, Valkia started to earn a reputation, so the challenges become less and less frequent. Now, Valkia's tribe were known to worship the god Khorne, or as they knew him, the Axe Father, as their particular deity, and they'd often offer any of the skulls they took or the blood they spilled to the blood god to honor him. Now, a particular demon prince of Slaanesh got word of Valkia and got word of her kind of feral beauty. And being a Slaaneshi demon prince, he had all kinds of desires on her. Theoretically, he first wanted to go and have a look. So he turns up at the feast halls of Valkia and says to her, "Look, Valkia, you're pretty. I like your feral beauty. You shall come and be my sex slave, essentially. Give up this ruling. You're a woman. Don't be silly. You're going to be my sex slave, and then we're going to leave. So get your stuff. We're going." And Valkia just flies into a berserker rage at the impudence of this Slaanesh princeling, and they just set about one of the most epic duels to have ever occurred in the Warhammer universe. For 2 days and 2 nights they fought each other. Her spear pointing and like thrusting and diving at the demon prince that he was, him using his immense strength and the gifts he'd been given by Slaanesh to rain down mighty blows that would have maybe otherwise killed another mortal, but Valkia's speed and aggression and agility were such that she could match the demon prince blow for blow. And eventually, after these 2 nights and 2 days, and with a huge swing of her spear, she decapitated the Slaanesh demon prince. Reveling in her victory and in the kind of FU to Slaanesh, she mounted the demon prince's head upon her shield and made a vow to herself on that day to honor her tribe's god Khorne, that she would march north through the chaos wastes into the realms of chaos and place the head of the demon prince at the foot of Khorne himself. So she gathers a retinue of her troops and she goes, "Okay guys, we're going to venture north with this mounted Slaanesh demon prince head on my shield, and we're going to go offer it to our god. Let's go." Now Slaanesh, having taken such offense at his demon prince being slain by a mere mortal, sends a horde of abominations dedicated to him after her. And indeed, in the northern wastes, they find that Valkia and her retinue find themselves completely surrounded. And despite one of the most valiant fights in the history of her tribe, they fought back to back for hours and hours. They were eventually overpowered, and Valkia herself was ripped to shreds by the Slaaneshi abominations. Khorne, having witnessed her acts of slaughtering, as a mortal, slaughtering a demon prince, and her dedication to him in making the march through the dangerous Chaos Realms, knowing that Slaanesh would be out for revenge, hugely admired Valkia's actions, although they arguably could be defined as slightly stupid, but still dedicated. And he let out a mighty roar that's said to have shaken the world and risen Valkia from the dead. He grabbed her in the palm of his mighty hand, having risen her from the dead, and started to reshape her to his liking, giving her the hooved legs similar to his own blood letters, and pulling horns from the bones of her skull itself, pulling out blood wings of skin for which she could set about the skies, and thus was born Valkia, the bringer of glory, essentially what would then become the equivalent of the Valkyrie for those worshippers of Chaos and Khorne. From then on, her role in the world was to swoop down and aid any Chaos warriors who were deemed worthy and usher their souls into the afterlife so they may feast in the feast halls of Khorne if they prove themselves on the battlefield. Now, this newly reborn Shield Maiden of Khorne first made herself known to the civilized nations of the world in the year of the imperial calendar 1396, during the siege of Karak Gulag, which is one of the northern Karaks, which I think has since been overrun and I don't think is inhabited anymore. Now, during this siege, Valkia strode down from the heavens on her wings of blood and leather and went to aid the Chaos Champion who was raiding at the time. And she instructed the Chaos Champion that under the orders of Khorne, they should kill by using the method of the Blood Raven. Now, the Blood Raven was a method of splitting a ribcage apart and pulling out an individual's lungs, flinging them over that person's shoulders onto their back, and having them sort of make the semblance of blood wings, and is a horribly torturous way to die. And Valkia is said to be the one who's introduced it to the Warhammer world. In our world, of course, it's been a Viking. That procedure is known as the Viking tradition of the Blood Eagle, but she invented it in the Warhammer world and is sort of renowned for having done so. And indeed, Wulfrik the Wanderer is said to have used her method on his arch nemesis in order to dispatch him as well. After that battle, Valkia promptly disappeared from the realms of civilization. No one's sure where she went. She was next to emerge in the year 2398, nearly 1,000 years later, emerging off the coast of Nordland. Now, Nordland at the time had word that a massive Norscan raiding party was about to come down and lay waste to the province. The royals in Slazenmund refused to help the coastal villages, refused to send soldiers to defend the coastal towns or villages, and these sort of smaller towns and the smaller villages were left to their own devices to protect themselves. Now, amongst this chaos, a simple fisherman known as Harald Dreisker managed to rally the populace of Nordland to try and organize some kind of defense against the Norscan raiders that were inevitably due to arrive on their coast. And sure enough, after a few weeks, the Norscan fleet did arrive, and Harald himself had managed to amass quite a significant army and a significant amount of ships. And he managed to sort of meet them before they made the coastline of Nordland and fight them at the sea. However, Valkia was on board one of these ships, and with a mighty throw of her spear, she managed to completely pulverize the ship that Harald had been on, sending all of the soldiers on it into the sea. And essentially, this meager resistance that Nordland had managed to put up stood very little chance. That is until a dwarven ironclad appeared over the horizon and started firing its cannon down on the Norscan raiders, smoke billowing from its powerful furnaces over the horizon, and the wooden longships of the Norscan tribe stood little chance against the might of an ironclad of the dwarven realms. The dwarves had not forgotten Valkia's previous history of them and had sent the ironclad to seek vengeance to settle the grudge. Eventually, the Norscan raiders were fought off with the help of the dwarves and the forces that Harald had managed to put together. Harald himself did survive the sort of attack by Valkia's spear, found nearly frozen to death on a beach. They did manage to find him and nurse him back to health. He quickly became a hero in Nordland, but a few weeks later was found murdered. Now, whether this was by Valkia herself, the jealous nobles of Nordland who saw the rising power of Harald as a threat, no one was really sure, but Harald himself had been murdered. Now, Valkia herself has built up a reputation in the north for being a fierce warrior, able to take down Demon Prince even as a mortal. Her skills now are almost unmatched. She's said of only to have lost once, and that was against the Chaos Lord Morton, who fought her to a standstill, but did not manage to defeat her as such. Another one of her famous encounters was during Archaon's quest to gather all of his magical items. He ended up in a fight with the Dark Elves, and he was ending up fighting against a Dark Elf sorceress aboard a dragon, and not having any necessarily flying units to thwart this dragon's massacre of his army. Archaon had killed a Dark Elf assailant and prayed to Khorne. Khorne answered Archaon and said Valkia to help, and Valkia immediately swooped down, decapitated the Dark Elf sorceress, and managed to, after a fierce battle, rip the throat out of the dragon and watch it tumble down to earth. Such is her ferocity. In terms of her implementation in Total War Warhammer, Valkia, because she's so dedicated to a single Chaos God, I suspect we may not see her until the third iteration of the game, when the Chaos Gods are split, because she is so tightly intertwined with Khorne. She does have some very interesting rules in gear, though. She does have the Mark of Khorne, which gives its own benefit. She can fly, and I do think with Valkia, and with these individual hero characters who can fly, like Malagor the Dark Omen, you need to implement an on-off flight toggle. Because at the moment, particularly with some of the stuff we're seeing from Bretonnia, the Royal Pegasus and the Hippogriffs, they all just dominate the sky, so you'd never bring flying characters if they ever in fact allow individual characters to fly, because they just get slaughtered in the sky instantly without being able to have the ability to land and force the other army to land its troops to attack you. So I think that's something that's necessary in the game, and I want to see Valkia flying. Fair enough, you can kind of CA got away with it with Malagor the Dark Omen and the greater demon that shows up with Archaon. but I think if you introduce Valkia, you have to have her flying. And essentially what her spear would be, I'd like to see it act as kind of flying version of Orion's spear, and it's just that she uses it as a missile weapon but can also use it in close melee as well. I think that would be really cool. Her spear itself is called Slaupnir. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it has armor piercing, it gives her +2 strength, and it gives her killing blow in the tabletop. Now we've seen killing blow as an ability with the undead, with the vampire Count Whites, and I'd like to see her given that ability as well, and have her weapon be massively armor piercing. The shield, of which she still has, like, now she's kind of stretched it out, but the idea is that that design on her shield is actually the head of the Slaaneshi demon prince she slaughtered, and that gives her a couple of bonuses as well. It effectively on the tabletop would reduce the amount of attacks against her by 1. So in Total War Warhammer, we'd see probably that implemented if they were staying true to the idea of a negative melee attack debuff. So that's what that would be. Maybe an aura, a small aura effect around her of negative melee attack would be what that shield could represent. And she has her Scarlet Armor, which is essentially just a really good armor. It would give her a really good saving throw and reduce the strength of nearby enemies. So maybe a reduction in weapon strength of nearby enemies to add to her aura buff that the shield gives her of the negative melee attack of enemies. I think that would be a great way to implement Valkia in Total War Warhammer. And that about sums it up for our Chaos Missing Legendary Lords. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. As I said, Chaos has a number of other Legendary Lords, but this video just covered the ones that were featured in the 8th edition of the Army Book of Chaos. I may do a second part eventually of the missing Chaos Legendary Lords, but these are the ones I see Creative Assembly implementing in the near to medium term. I think particularly the ones that aren't affiliated with a single Chaos God, like Wulfrik the Wanderer, Throgg, and Galrauch, may be the ones we see first. The ones like Festus the Leech Lord, Vilitch the Curseling, and Valkia the Bloody, who are very much attached to a specific god, I imagine they'll be implemented with the 3rd iteration of the game, unless they introduce different forms of chaos magic before then. But that about sums it up, as I said, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one. If you did enjoy it, please do drop a like. It really helps the channel out. And subscribe for more content on Total War Warhammer lore, gameplay, and news. Thanks for joining me on this one, guys, and have a great day.